Hey guys, welcome to the Popcorn Session channel. In today's movie, we're going to tell the story of this guy who does everything to become a Marine. But right from the start, he and his unit are sent to Saudi Arabia and will have to experience hell for months. So let's go, and let's watch Jarhead from 2005. Subscribe and leave a like. We start with Drill Instructor Sergeant Fitch Feet welcoming the new recruits of the U.S. Navy, explaining that they are no longer black or white men, but green because that's the color of the Army. Then he approaches a recruit named Anthony because his father served in the Vietnam War. Soon the sergeant asks if he has a girlfriend, and the guy replies that he does. But the sergeant tells him that by now she must be with someone else and orders Anthony to do 25 push-ups because, according to Feet, that's how many times the guy's girlfriend cheated on him while he was in the Army. Anthony does the push-ups and starts to regret enlisting. After this, the sergeant continues to torment him, punishing him with physical exercises when he can't complete a task, and questioning why he enlisted. Under pressure, Anthony admits that he only enlisted because he didn't know what he wanted to do with his life after graduating from school. After going through basic training, the recruits are put on a bus headed for Pendleton Base, and we see that Anthony is admiring a photo of his girlfriend, Christina, to ease his longing for her. Upon arriving at the location, he meets an officer who notices that his family has a long history in the military. Because of this, the officer decides to assign him to a platoon of troublemaking soldiers to see if Anthony can straighten them out. However, the opposite happens, and Anthony's fellow soldiers tie him to a bed using tape and heat up an iron to brand him with a symbol, causing him to pass out. But a few minutes later he wakes up and is surprised to see that he has no marks on his body. One of the soldiers, named Troy, explains that it was just a prank and that if Anthony wants a mark, he has to earn it later. Anthony is having difficulty using the bathroom and took a laxative to try to solve the problem. Nevertheless, Sergeant Sykes opens the bathroom door and is impressed when he hears that it took 6 soldiers to restrain Anthony. Because of this, he offers Anthony the opportunity to join the sniper unit. Moving on to the next day, Anthony reports for sniper training, and Sergeant Sykes explains that only 8 will pass, while the rest will be eliminated. He decides to mess with Anthony a bit and makes him play a tune using only his mouth while the other soldiers struggle not to laugh. Over the next few days, Sergeant Sykes begins training the soldiers. First, he gives a lesson on camouflage, telling the aspirants that snipers should even urinate in their pants if necessary, to stay put and avoid revealing their position to the enemy. In the second lesson, they engage in paintball training to simulate a real confrontation, and in the third, the sergeant teaches them how to measure distance in yards and determine wind speed by spitting on their fingers and holding them up. In the final part of the course, the aspirants learn to shoot with sniper rifles, and Anthony demonstrates his talent by hitting a distant target with precision. They also have to crawl under barbed wire while other soldiers shoot live rounds above them to get used to a real war scenario. Unfortunately, this recruit ends up panicking and stands up, taking a shot and dying in the process. After this, only our protagonist and 7 other soldiers graduate, and Sergeant Sykes assigns them to either the spotter or shooter role, selecting Anthony as one of the shooters. The sergeant then hands them their rifles and has them recite an oath that states that without their rifles, they are nothing. Troy and Anthony are assigned to form a pair, and while Troy locates the target using a scope, Anthony takes the shot with the sniper rifle. One day, everyone in the platoon is watching the news and discovers that Saddam Hussein has invaded Kuwait. Troy remarks that their time has come. As a result, Anthony and 5,000 other soldiers are flown to Kuwait to participate in the Gulf War. Lieutenant Colonel Kaczynski explains that Saddam Hussein has about 1 million soldiers, and that they have no mercy for their enemies, even using chemical weapons, which are considered a war crime. However, Kaczynski clarifies that their mission is not to attack but to protect the Iraqi oil fields, which they want to preserve and not destroy. They assemble the camp in the middle of the desert Escalante, and the other soldiers stay crazy when they saw the photos of his wife Anthony and say he should soon shoot yourself in the foot to get back to home before someone steals a girlfriend. Suddenly Sergeant Sykes arrives by surprise and gives a minute for them to invest in clothing protection that serves to nullify the gas suffocating. But when time runs out, one of the soldiers manages to invest the suit in time, and that's why the sergeant says to everyone, they are dead. As the days pass, the soldiers start patrolling the desert to get accustomed to the hot climate. Additionally, Sergeant Sykes teaches them how to detect hidden landmines using only their knives. However, as time goes on, the soldiers start getting bored and even organize a scorpion fighting ring, betting money to see who the winner will be. Now, 62 days have passed since Anthony arrived in the desert, and there are not just 5,000 soldiers, but 115,000. However, there is still no sign of the enemy troops, and the soldiers are more bored than ever. They even create a wall of shame to display pictures of unfaithful women who have cheated on some of the soldiers in the camp. Anthony checks this wall every day to see if his girlfriend Christina is among them. Sergeant Sykes informs the soldiers that some reporters are arriving to interview them, but strictly prohibits them from complaining during the interviews, emphasizing that soldiers should not express their own opinions. So they start giving interviews, falsely claiming that everything is fine and that they are loving their time in the desert. However, Anthony decides to disobey the sergeant and admits to being terrified of the bombs that the Iraqis could launch at them. After Anthony's revelation, the reporter asks what resources they have to protect themselves from chemical attacks. And the sergeant showcases the NBC protective suits, which are designed for both chemical and biological attacks, as well as radiation. The reporter questions whether the soldiers can wear these suits in the scorching desert heat, and to prove that they can, the sergeant has them play a game of American football while wearing the suits. However, Dave starts a fight with other soldiers, embarrassing the sergeant in front of the cameras, as it demonstrates that the platoon he commands is undisciplined. Then the sergeant provides water for the soldiers to show that they can stay hydrated even while wearing the masks, since they have tubes for drinking. However, the soldiers only complain and do not follow the sergeant's instructions. As if that weren't enough, they strip down in front of the cameras and engage in a striptease. At night, the sergeant decides to get back at them for their antics and orders the soldiers to pile sandbags under the rain, making them work hard. Afterward, they are resting in the tent, and Anthony receives his dog tag, but becomes irritated when he notices that there's an error in one of the pieces of information on it. For those who don't know, a dog tag is essentially an identification tag that contains information such as the soldier's name, blood type, etc. Additionally, Anthony receives a letter from his girlfriend Christina, in which she mentions that she has been talking a lot with someone named Crow, the hotel manager where she works. This makes Anthony suspect that he might be cheated on, and he becomes devastated. Mastroy tries to console him, mentioning that they will have 2 days of leave to clear their heads. The next day, the soldiers begin their leave, and they are allowed to make calls to their families. Anthony decides to call his girlfriend and subtly asks about this person, Crow. Christina becomes irritated and insists that he is just a friend. But before they can continue their conversation, the call is abruptly disconnected. After this, Anthony is in the bathroom and sees Christina's reflection in the mirror, which disgusts him and causes him to start vomiting sand. However, suddenly he wakes up startled and realizes it was just a nightmare. Seeing that his friend is suffering, Troy invites him to watch the movie, The French Sniper, that Officer Detman's wife sent him. So, the soldiers gather in the living room and put in the tape to play. However, instead of the movie, a steamy scene appears, and Detman soon realizes that it's his wife with the neighbor, as she recorded everything and sent the tape to get back at him. He starts crying and leaves the room. Anthony and some other soldiers take advantage of his absence to replay the tape, but Troy stops them, explaining that it's a terrible thing to do to the guy. Troy then wonders why Anthony wanted to see the tape, and Anthony admits that he wanted to know what betrayal looks like, suspecting that Christina might have done the same thing with that hotel manager. Later, they return to the camp, and we learn that 122 days have already passed, with approximately 390,000 American soldiers protecting this vast desert. However, Anthony remains sad because of his girlfriend. So he decides to buy several liters of liquor to drink with the guys and celebrate Christmas Eve. It's his turn to be on watch outside during the night, but he asks Fergus to take his place, promising to make it up the next day. While everyone is drinking and having fun inside the tent, Fergus starts cooking some sausages outside and gets distracted. A fire breaks out, and Ferguson tries to put it out but accidentally spills a gallon of fuel on the flames. The fire spreads and reaches the ammunition crates, causing gunfire-like noises in the camp. This leads the soldiers to believe they are under attack by the Iraqis. However, Fergus explains what happened, and the next day, Sergeant Sykes discovers that the incident occurred because Anthony had taken alcohol without permission and had also delegated his watch duty to someone else. The sergeant explains that he doesn't want someone as irresponsible as Anthony covering them in a real combat situation. That's why he decides to expel him from the squad of snipers. After that, the guy is placed to burn the feces of camp bathrooms. But it's not as simple as you think, because you need to stir everything while it boils and have to wait for that bad smell, besides get all covered in poop smoke. Afternoon, Anthony is very weak mentally, and that's why they threatened a bullet in iron, explaining that will lie to the officers, that it was a gunshot accidental to get a few years of chain. And then Fergus argues that no was to blame, because that lookout was for be made by Anthony. But the guy points out your rifle at him, causing Fergus despair and start crying. Then Anthony's mental health worsens furthermore, and he hands over his gun to Fergus, and asks the guy to finish him because he can't take it anymore, Army. And also due to the fact that probably been betrayed by Christina. But fortunately, Ferguson did not pull the trigger, and Antony calms down and returns to normal. After that, the soldiers are patrolling the desert, and Troy gets knowing what happened in the tent and makes Antony apologize to Fergus only. Suddenly, they hear some noises shot, and then come closer to see what is. They find some silhouettes appearing on the horizon, but the warm air makes it very difficult for soldiers to see, and so they can't figure out if are allies or enemies. But soon the soldiers realize that they are some men Arabs who are approaching, and Troy orders them to form a line and point your weapons in the direction of the guys, but to avoid a conflict between path towards the Arabs talking in their language, and discover that someone shot their camels after. As the soldiers are returning to the camp in a truck, they express surprise that Antony has learned to speak Arabic. They encounter a woman wearing a turban driving a car, and Dave starts making obscene gestures toward her, angering Antony. Upon reaching the camp, Sergeant Sykes reveals that Saddam Hussein has declared a holy Muslim war against the infidels and enemies of Islam. Antony and the other soldiers are sent to protect the border because the war has finally arrived. Sykes explains that they anticipate at least 30,000 casualties on the first day of the conflict. He provides injections and pills for the soldiers to use to delay the effects of chemical attacks. However, one of the soldiers is afraid to take these pills due to potential long-term side effects. Sykes reassures him that he doesn't have to take them if he doesn't want to, but emphasizes that victims of chemical attacks carry lifelong scars. The soldiers then begin digging holes to sleep in for the night. However, Troy loses patience and expresses frustration about having to fight in the open desert, which lacks natural cover compared to places like Vietnam with trees and buildings for protection. Antony becomes irritated because Troy is essentially undermining troop morale. Sykes calls Antony aside for a private conversation and reveals that they discovered Troy lied about not having a criminal record. As a result, Troy will be expelled from the army and face punishment upon their return home. Antony finally understands why Troy has been so agitated and asks why he didn't disclose that he would be expelled from the army. However, Troy tells him to mind his own business. During the night, Antony receives back the t-shirt he had given as a gift to Christina months ago, along with a note from her saying that she will always love him, but that it's all over between them. Kruger remarks that they are all just disposable Marines, and nobody cares about them, not even their families or girlfriends. Antony then shares that Troy will be expelled from the Marines, and in response, the others hold Troy down and use a hot iron to brand his skin with the Marine Corps emblem. This leaves Troy emotional because only deserving soldiers receive this mark. You might have thought that David would face consequences for making those obscene gestures toward the Arab woman. But the reality is that in some of these countries, a man's word carries more weight than a woman's, and it's likely that she would be the one punished if she were to report something, not the soldier. Continuing with the story, the Iraqis start firing at them using artillery, and Antony is the only one standing without taking cover in the trenches. Sykes and the others urge Antony to seek shelter, but he is so mesmerized that he can't hear them. He soon realizes that he has urinated in his pants. Sykes then asks Antony to fetch a battery for the radio in the truck. Antony runs to avoid the bombs and manages to return with the battery, but he soon realizes it's discharged. The Iraqis start to retreat, and the Marines seize the opportunity to advance and gain more territory. Some jets appear on the horizon, and David celebrates, thinking they are allies. However, the jets approach and attack, resulting in casualties among the Marines who survive. They eventually reach a vast highway with several vehicles and burned bodies of innocent people who were trying to escape the war. The soldiers decide to camp in this area, and Antony vomits upon seeing the bodies up close. However, they soon spot smoke trails in the distance, realizing that the Iraqis have managed to destroy the oil wells. The contaminated smoke reaches the clouds, and a few minutes later, it starts raining oil on them. Later that night, the ground is covered in oil, and the soldiers are digging trenches to sleep. Suddenly, drops of oil fall into Kruger's eyes, nearly blinding him. After this series of events, Antony is burying the body of a civilian they used for play. Soon, he finds an oil-covered horse, and Sykes approaches to reprimand Dave for disrespecting the body of a war victim. As they talk, Sykes reveals that he could have chosen to stay with his family, work with his brother, and make more money than in the army. However, he chose to serve to witness things that ordinary people don't see, such as the sight of burning oil. The next day, Lieutenant Colonel Kaczynski calls upon the two best snipers in the company, Antony and Troy. He explains that they need to eliminate two high-ranking officers who were spotted in a control tower. Without these officers, the enemy battalion will become disorganized and likely surrender. Antony and Troy advance through enemy territory and take cover in a building overlooking the control tower. While preparing the shot, the Major interrupts them and advises against firing, as he will request an airstrike to eliminate the enemies. Troy becomes indignant and argues that they have permission from the Lieutenant Colonel to shoot. However, the Major attempts to request the airstrike, causing Troy to lose patience and snatch the phone from his hands. Anthony tries to calm his friend, who is having a breakdown, but the Major understands Troy's situation and does not arrest him. The jets carry out the airstrike, but Anthony and Troy do not receive proper credit for the mission's success. They realize they haven't eliminated a single enemy soldier so far. Upon walking back to the camp, they come across a scene that initially frightens them: 2 heads impaled on stakes. However, they soon realize it's just a prank, and everyone is celebrating the victory in the war. The story illustrates how war profoundly affects soldiers, especially when they don't have the opportunity to prove their worth in meaningful missions. Continuing with the story, the soldiers start firing their guns into the air to celebrate, and Anthony does the same, firing his rifle for the first time since the war began. After this, the military personnel return to the United States and are warmly welcomed by the people. A Vietnam War veteran even shows up to congratulate them. A few days later, Anthony visits his ex-girlfriend and realizes that she is now living with the hotel manager. Meanwhile, David is enjoying life, drinking at a bar with a woman, and Kruger is giving an important presentation in his new job. Cortez is at an amusement park with his wife and children, and Sykes has returned to the battlefield. However, one day, Fergus visits Sykes to deliver the news that Troy has passed away. Sykes is devastated as he sees his friend's body in the casket. Finally, Anthony looks out of his house window and sees an image of the desert, emphasizing that he will always be a Marine, no matter how many years pass or what happens in the future. Hey folks, what would you do if you had to fight in a war? Do you think you'd be capable of being a sniper? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and sending hugs.